The military transport helicopter thundered through the mountain pass, buffeted by high winds that seemed determined to prevent our arrival. Through the small window, I could see nothing but sheer rock faces and dense pine forests far below. We had been flying for hours, and I had long since lost track of our location. That was the point, I supposed. First time at Fort Varian, Sergeant Carter shouted the pilot over the roar of the rotors. "Yes, sir," I replied, gripping my seat as we hit another pocket of turbulence. "You'll get used to it," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maybe. Fort Varian wasn't on any official maps. According to my transfer papers, I was being stationed at a communications support facility in Colorado, but the flight had been long enough that I suspected we might be in a different state altogether. As a communications specialist with the Army, I'd worked at classified locations before, but never one that required a blindfolded flight for the final approach. The helicopter dipped suddenly, and my stomach lurched as we began our descent. Minutes later, I felt the satisfying thud of landing gear touching down on solid ground. When the side door slid open, I was greeted by the biting cold of mountain air and a view that took my breath away. Fort Varian was built directly into the mountainside, a massive reinforced entrance leading deep into the rock, surrounded by smaller outbuildings and antenna arrays. The landing pad was positioned on an outcropping that offered a panoramic view of endless mountains stretching in every direction. No roads, no towns, nothing but wilderness. "Sergeant Olivia Carter," a stern voice pulled my attention away from the view. A tall man in a captain's uniform approached, his posture rigid and unwelcoming. "Captain Marcus Hale, head of security. Welcome to Fort Varian." His handshake was brief and formal. "Your arrival wasn't expected until tomorrow," he said, glancing at his watch with annoyance. "There was an opening on today's transport, sir," I explained. "I was told to take it." He nodded curtly. "Follow me. I'll show you to your quarters and brief you on protocols." As we walked toward the main entrance, I noticed armed guards positioned at regular intervals along the perimeter. They weren't the bored kind you'd see at most bases. These soldiers were alert, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. One of them stared at me with such intensity that I nearly stumbled. "Don't mind Corporal Davis," Captain Hale said, noticing my discomfort. "We don't get many new faces here." The main doors were massive thick steel with multiple security measures. Captain Hale placed his palm on a scanner, then leaned forward for a retinal scan. The doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a long corridor carved directly into the mountain and lined with fluorescent lights. Fort Varian houses some of the military's most sensitive communications equipment. Hale explained as we walked. "You'll be monitoring deep space satellite transmissions, weather patterns, and other data that comes in from our array. Most of it is automated, but human oversight is required for anomaly detection." "What kind of anomalies, sir?" I asked. He paused, turning to face me. "That's above your clearance level, Sergeant. You report what you see, nothing more." We passed several heavy doors marked with security clearance requirements, most required levels far above my own. Groups of personnel walked briskly through the hallways, conversations dying as we approached. The atmosphere was tense, not the normal efficiency of a military installation, but something more anxious. "Here are your quarters," Hale said, stopping at a door marked B17. He handed me a keycard. "Dining hall is level C, medical is level A. Your shift starts tomorrow at 7 a.m. You'll be working with Corporal Anderson. He'll show you the ropes." "Thank you, sir. Is there anything else I should know?" Captain Hale hesitated, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Stay within authorized areas. This mountain has many restricted sections for a reason. Wander where you don't belong, and you'll find yourself on the next transport out. Or worse." With that ominous warning, he turned and walked away. My quarters were small but private, a luxury on military bases. A single bed, desk, small bathroom, and a locker for personal belongings. No windows, of course. We were inside a mountain. The walls were bare concrete, painted an institutional beige that did nothing to create warmth. A digital clock on the wall displayed the time, 6:15 p.m. I had missed dinner. After unpacking my few belongings, I decided to explore the sections of the base that were accessible to me. Level C housed the dining facility, currently empty except for a few late workers grabbing coffee. Level D contained recreation rooms, a small gym, a library with outdated books, and a common area with uncomfortable-looking furniture. Few people were around, and those who were eyed me with suspicion. "You must be Sergeant Carter," a cheerful voice broke through the silence. I turned to see a young man with a wide smile and glasses. "Corporal Jamie Anderson, but everyone calls me Jax. I'll be working with you in communications." His friendliness was a welcome change from the cold reception I'd received so far. "Call me Liv," I said, shaking his offered hand. "Hungry? The kitchen staff always keeps some food aside for night shift workers. I know where they hide it," he said with a conspiratorial wink. Over sandwiches in the empty dining hall, Jax filled me in on life at Fort Varian. He'd been stationed here for 18 months and had adapted to the isolation. "It gets easier," he assured me, "though some people never adjust to being underground so much. We get about 1 hour of outdoor time per week, weather permitting." "What exactly are we monitoring up here?" I asked, keeping my voice low despite the empty room. Jax glanced around before leaning closer. "Officially, satellite communications, atmospheric disturbances, the usual stuff. But there's more going on. Have you met Dr. Rhodes yet?" I shook my head. "She runs the research division. Brilliant scientist, completely obsessed with her work. Barely acknowledges the existence of military personnel." He took a sip of his coffee. "There are sections of this base that even Captain Hale doesn't have access to. Only Dr. Rhodes and General Wallace can go everywhere." "General Wallace runs the base." "Yeah, though you rarely see him. Keeps to himself mostly. Emerges for inspections or when something important happens." Jax checked his watch. "I should go. Early shift tomorrow. Want me to walk you back to your quarters?" I declined, finishing my sandwich alone in the cavernous dining hall. As I made my way back to my room, I noticed a group of personnel in white lab coats hurrying down a corridor, carrying equipment I didn't recognize. They disappeared behind a door marked Level 5 clearance only. Something about their urgent pace made me uneasy. That night, I dreamed of mountains and whispers. In the dream, I was lost in endless corridors, following voices that always stayed just ahead of me. When I finally found the source, it was a glowing object speaking in a language I somehow understood, but couldn't translate. I woke up sweating, the digital clock showing 3:17 a.m. The concrete walls seemed to close in around me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of the mountain above. My first day passed in a blur of training and orientation. Jax showed me the communications center, a large room filled with monitoring equipment, screens displaying satellite feeds, and atmospheric data. Our job was to watch for anomalies and report them up the chain. "What constitutes an anomaly?" I asked as Jax walked me through the systems. "Anything that doesn't match expected patterns," he said vaguely. "You'll know it when you see it." The work was straightforward, but tedious. Hour after hour of watching data streams and satellite feeds, most showing nothing but empty sky or weather patterns. By the end of my shift, my eyes were strained and my back ached from sitting. Days passed, falling into a routine. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The underground environment messed with my sense of time, making each day blend into the next. I became acquainted with a few other personnel, though most kept to themselves. The only person who seemed genuinely friendly was Jax, who made a point of checking in on me daily. One night, during a particularly quiet shift, Jax brought up the base's history. "Fort Varian has been operational since the 1960s, he said, swiveling in his chair. "Originally built as a fallout shelter during the Cold War, then repurposed for communications when the satellite program expanded." "Seems like overkill for a communications station," I remarked, gesturing to the heavy security and restricted areas. Jax lowered his voice. That's because communications is just the cover. There's a reason we're monitoring deep space so intensely. He leaned closer. About 2 years ago, before I arrived, something happened. No one talks about it openly, but I've pieced together bits from the longer-serving personnel. There was some kind of incident. The base went into complete lockdown for weeks. What kind of incident? He shrugged. No one will say exactly. But ever since, security has been tightened, and Dr. Rhodes' research team doubled in size. He was about to continue when the door to the communications center opened, and Captain Hale walked in. Jax immediately turned back to his monitor, all trace of conspiracy gone from his demeanor. "Evening check, Corporal Sergeant," Hale said, eyes scanning our workstations. "Any anomalies to report?" "No, sir," we replied in unison. Captain Hale lingered, his gaze intense. "Remember your training, Sergeant Carter. Report everything, no matter how insignificant it might seem." With that cryptic reminder, he left. "He's been on edge lately," Jax whispered once Hale was gone. "All the senior staff have." A week into my assignment, I was scheduled for my first night shift alone. Jax had shown me all the systems and procedures, and I felt confident handling the quiet hours between midnight and 6 a.m. The communications center was eerie at night, the hum of equipment the only sound besides my own breathing. At approximately 2:30 a.m., I was running routine checks on the satellite feeds when something caught my attention. A small disturbance in the upper atmosphere, barely noticeable among the data streams. I zoomed in on the anomaly, watching as it grew more pronounced. According to my training, this was likely just space debris or a meteor entering the atmosphere, common enough occurrences that usually burned up long before reaching the ground. But something about this reading was different. The object wasn't following the expected trajectory for debris. Its speed was fluctuating, almost as if it were controlling its descent, and it was heading directly toward our general region of the mountains. I followed protocol, logging the anomaly and sending an alert to the duty officer. Within minutes, Captain Hale burst into the communications center, followed by a woman I hadn't met before. She was older, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a lab coat over civilian clothes. "Show me," she demanded, not bothering with introductions. I pulled up the data, pointing out the anomaly's trajectory and unusual characteristics. The woman, who I assumed must be Dr. Rhodes, studied the screens intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to something like excitement. "How long until impact?" she asked, her voice tight with controlled energy. I checked the calculations. Based on current trajectory and speed, approximately 17 minutes. Impact zone appears to be within 20 miles of this facility. Captain Hale was already on his radio, issuing rapid orders. "Retrieval team, suit up. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Dr. Rhodes turned to me, finally acknowledging my presence directly. "Sergeant, continue monitoring. Track any changes in trajectory or velocity. Record everything." She turned to leave, then paused. "You've done well to notice this. Some things want to be found." That cryptic statement hung in the air as she hurried out, leaving me alone with the increasingly urgent readings on my screens. The anomaly was growing brighter on the thermal imaging, its heat signature unlike anything I'd seen before. As it descended, I could track it visually through our perimeter cameras, a streak of brilliant blue-white light cutting through the night sky. The base erupted into controlled chaos. Alarms blared and security personnel rushed to their stations. Through the monitoring system, I watched as a team in specialized gear loaded into vehicles and headed out through a tunnel that I hadn't known existed. General Wallace himself appeared on the command frequency, issuing orders from somewhere deep within the facility. Acting on instinct rather than orders, I hacked into the retrieval team's helmet cameras, a violation of protocol that could end my career, but my curiosity overwhelmed my caution. The feeds were staticky, but I could make out enough. The team had reached a clearing about 15 miles from the base, where something had carved a trench into the earth. The object itself was partially buried, but still glowing with an eerie blue light. It wasn't a meteor or satellite debris. The object was clearly manufactured, a smooth, oval shape about the size of a small car, with no visible seams or joints. Strange markings covered its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and change even as the cameras focused on them. As the team approached, their instruments began to malfunction, static cutting across the video feeds. The last clear image I saw was Captain Hale reaching toward the object, his gloved hand hovering just above its surface. Then all feeds went dead simultaneously. I frantically tried to restore the connection, but something was jamming all signals from the impact site. 20 minutes later, the base lockdown alarms activated. A calm, automated voice announced, "All personnel return to quarters immediately. This is a level 1 containment protocol. Repeat, all personnel return to quarters immediately." I remained at my post, unsure whether the order applied to communications personnel on duty. 10 minutes later, Dr. Rhodes returned, her lab coat singed and her face pale. "Sergeant, you are relieved," she said, her voice hoarse. "Return to your quarters and remain there until further notice." "Ma'am, what happened out there? What was that object?" Her eyes narrowed. "That's classified, Sergeant, but I'll tell you this. What fell tonight is only the beginning." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "You saw it first. Remember that. It chose you to witness its arrival." Before I could question her bizarre statement, security personnel arrived to escort me to my quarters. As I was led away, I noticed Dr. Rhodes huddled with a group of scientists, examining what appeared to be fragments of the blue glowing material. The base remained under lockdown for 3 days. Meals were delivered to our quarters and all non-essential personnel were confined to their rooms. The lack of information bred rumors that spread like wildfire through the text messaging system. Some claimed it was a crashed experimental aircraft, others a satellite with nuclear components. The wildest rumors suggested it was something not from Earth at all. When restrictions were finally eased, the base had changed. Additional security checkpoints had been established, and large sections were newly designated as restricted areas. Personnel spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders before sharing information. I returned to my post in the communications center to find new monitoring systems installed and additional personnel assigned to our section. Jax was there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Thank God you're okay," he said when he saw me. "I was on the retrieval team. I can't even describe it." "What happened out there?" I asked, checking that we weren't being monitored. Jax ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "We found the object. Captain Hale ordered us to secure the perimeter while he and Dr. Rhodes approached it. When Hale touched it, he swallowed hard. Something happened. A pulse of energy knocked us all back. When we got up, the object had changed. It opened somehow, though I never saw any seams or doors. Inside was empty, or at least it looked empty." "What do you mean, looked empty?" "There was nothing physical inside, but there was a distortion, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt." Dr. Rhodes was ecstatic, taking readings and samples. "But Captain Hale..." Jax lowered his voice to barely a whisper. "He hasn't been the same since." He stood there, staring into that emptiness for almost 5 minutes before Dr. Rhodes could pull him away. Over the next few days, strange incidents began to occur throughout the base. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Lights flickered in patterns that the engineering team couldn't explain. Personnel reported hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing movements in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look. During my shift, I met Private Emily Grant, a young soldier assigned to monitor the security feeds. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "You're the new communications specialist, right?" she asked during a quiet moment. "The one who spotted the object?" I nodded, and she glanced around before continuing. "I've been having these dreams since it arrived," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "In the dreams, I'm walking through the base, but it's different, older somehow, like I'm seeing it from decades ago, and there's something following me, always just out of sight." "Just stress in the weird environment down here," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Emily shook her head. "It's more than that. Yesterday, I lost 3 hours. I was at my post at 3 p.m. and suddenly it was 6 p.m. and I had no memory of the time in between. According to the logs, I never left my station. I was responding to communications, making log entries, but I have no memory of any of it. Similar reports began to circulate. Personnel losing time, finding themselves in sections of the base with no memory of how they got there. Others reported writing in journals or logs with handwriting that wasn't their own. The medical bay became crowded with people reporting headaches, insomnia, and vivid hallucinations. Captain Hale's behavior became increasingly erratic. Once rigid and by the book, he now seemed distracted, his eyes constantly unfocused as if listening to something no one else could hear. During briefings, he would stop mid-sentence, staring at empty corners of the room before continuing, as if nothing had happened. 2 weeks after the object's arrival, I ran into Jax in the dining hall. He looked around cautiously before sliding a small data drive across the table to me. I accessed some classified files, he whispered. This isn't the first time something has fallen near Fort Varian. There were incidents in 1974, 1988, and 2002. Each time, the object was retrieved and stored somewhere in this base. How did you get this information? I asked, pocketing the drive. I have access to the technical maintenance systems. The security on old archival servers isn't as tight as they think. He leaned closer. Meet me in Computer Lab B at midnight. I'll show you what I found. That night, I slipped out of my quarters after curfew, making my way carefully to the computer lab. The base was quieter at night, the reduced staffing making it easier to move unnoticed. Jax was already there when I arrived, working rapidly on one of the terminals. These files were deeply buried, he explained as I sat beside him, but they paint a disturbing picture. Fort Varian wasn't built as a communications station or a fallout shelter. It was specifically constructed to study and contain objects exactly like the one that fell 2 weeks ago. The files detailed previous incidents, objects of unknown origin falling from space, retrieved and brought to Fort Varian for study. The earliest reports dated back to the 1960s, each documenting strange phenomena following the retrieval equipment failures, personnel experiencing lost time, mysterious illnesses. Look at this, Jack said, pointing to a heavily redacted report from 1988. After they brought in the object, 5 personnel died under unexplained circumstances within a month. The official cause was listed as radiation exposure, but internal memos suggest something else entirely. One memo, written by the base commander at the time, stood out. The entity appears to influence mental states. Personnel in prolonged proximity report auditory and visual hallucinations consistent with severe schizophrenia. Recommend immediate containment protocol, blue light. What's blue light? I asked. Unknown, Jax replied. That part of the database is locked behind security I can't crack. But whatever these objects are, they're not simply technology or debris. The scientists here have been studying them for decades, trying to understand their properties and origin. Another file contained fragmentary notes about non-terrestrial artifacts and references to an ancient conflict between unknown entities. The writer theorized that the objects were weapons or monitoring devices from this conflict, dormant for millennia but still actively broadcasting to somewhere. As we dug deeper, we found personnel files for Dr. Eleanor Rhodes. She had been at Fort Varian since 1997, originally brought in as a physicist to study one of the fallen objects. Over the years, her research focus had shifted from analysis to potential applications. Recent notes mention harnessing the unique properties and breakthrough potential for national security. She's trying to weaponize whatever these things are, Jack said grimly. And based on these reports, that's incredibly dangerous. A noise in the corridor outside made us freeze. Footsteps approached, paused outside the door, then continued past. We both exhaled in relief. We need to see what they're doing with the objects, I whispered. All these files refer to a containment area called Vault 0. Any idea where that might be? Jax thought for a moment. Level F is restricted to everyone but top researchers and security. It might be down there. Can you get us access? He hesitated, then nodded. I can clone a temporary access card, but if we're caught down there, it's not just a reprimand, we could be facing serious charges. We need to know what we're dealing with, I insisted. People are being affected, and no one's telling us the truth. The next night, we put our plan into action. Using his technical expertise, Jax created a temporary access card that would get us into level F. We waited until the graveyard shift, when staffing was minimal, and made our way to the restricted elevator. Level F was unlike the rest of the base. The utilitarian concrete gave way to sterile white corridors and sophisticated security systems. We moved carefully, avoiding the cameras Jax had identified in his schematics. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. At the end of a long corridor, we found it. A massive vault door marked simply 0. The security here was beyond anything I'd seen in the military. Retinal scanners, palm readers, and what appeared to be a voice recognition system. "We can't get in there," Jax whispered, disappointment evident in his voice. "Maybe we don't need to," I replied, pointing to an adjacent room labeled Observation. The security on this door was less intense, a simple keycard scanner that Jax's cloned card might work on. To our surprise, the card worked. The observation room was dark except for the glow of monitors showing various angles of the vault interior. What we saw took my breath away. The vault was a massive circular chamber, its walls lined with containment units. Each unit held an object similar to what had fallen 2 weeks ago, some smaller, some larger, but all bearing the same unearthly glow and shifting symbols. In the center of the room stood the newest arrival, placed on a raised platform surrounded by monitoring equipment. Dr. Rhodes was there, working alone despite the late hour. She moved from the new object to the other containment units, taking readings and making notes. Her movements were strange, jerky and unnatural, as if she were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. As we watched, she approached the central object and placed her hand on its surface. The symbols began to glow more intensely, and a visible current of energy passed from the object into her body. She convulsed briefly but didn't remove her hand. Instead, she began speaking, not in English or any language I recognized, but in a series of clicks and hums that made my skin crawl. "What the hell is she doing?" Jax whispered, his face pale in the monitor's glow. Before I could respond, the door to the observation room slid open. Captain Hale stood there, his expression unreadable. "I've been watching you two," he said, his voice oddly flat. "Curious little insects, aren't you?" We stood frozen, caught red-handed, in a highly restricted area, but instead of calling security or placing us under arrest, Hale simply walked into the room, letting the door close behind him. "You want to know what's happening here, why Fort Varian exists?" He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Dr. Rhodes thinks she's studying them, using them. She's wrong. They're using us." "Sir?" I managed, trying to maintain some semblance of military protocol despite the bizarre situation. "The objects are beacons, Sergeant Carter, markers dropped by something ancient, something that's been watching Earth for longer than humans have existed." He moved closer, and I noticed a strange rhythm to his breathing, too regular, almost mechanical. They activate in cycles, calling home to their creators. This cycle began 3 years ago, and it's reaching its peak. "Captain, I think you need medical attention," Jax said carefully. Hale laughed, a sound so unlike his usual stern demeanor that it sent chills down my spine. I've never been clearer. When I touched it, it showed me everything. The war between them, fought across galaxies. The weapons they created, weapons that could destroy planets, reshape reality itself. One side lost, went into hiding. The other scattered these markers across thousands of worlds, waiting for the losers to re-emerge. As he spoke, I noticed something disturbing. His pupils were dilating and contracting in rhythm with his words, pulsing like the symbols on the objects. "The one I touched," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's different from the others. It's awake. It's called the others from their dormant state, and now they're calling home." On the monitors, Dr. Rhodes had finished her strange communion with the object and was now working frantically at a computer terminal. Data scrolled across her screen too fast to read. "We should go, sir," I said, trying to edge toward the door. "Report this to General Wallace." "Wallace knows," Hale said dismissively. "He's been studying these objects for decades, trying to unlock their power, but he doesn't understand what's coming." He turned to look at the monitors, his expression almost reverent. "They'll be here soon, the ones who scattered the markers. They'll come to collect what's theirs and deal with any infestation they find." "Infestation?" Jax asked, though I could tell from his expression he already knew the answer. "Us," Hale replied simply. "Humanity, a temporary condition on this planet, soon to be corrected." In one swift motion I reached for the alarm panel on the wall. Hale moved with inhuman speed, his hand clamping around my wrist with crushing force. Up close, I could see that the whites of his eyes had a faint blue glow matching the objects in the vault. "Don't," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "It's too late for warnings, too late for anything but acceptance." Jax tackled him from the side, breaking his grip on my wrist. "Run, Liv," he shouted as they crashed into the monitoring equipment. I hit the alarm, and immediately, sirens blared throughout the level. Through the observation window, I saw Dr. Rhodes look up in alarm, then quickly begin shutting down her equipment. Hale threw Jax off with terrifying strength, sending him crashing into the wall. As he turned toward me, his face contorted in rage. The door burst open and security personnel flooded in, weapons drawn. "Captain Hale is compromised," I shouted over the alarms. "The objects in the vault are affecting personnel." The security team hesitated, clearly confused about detaining their superior officer. Hale used that moment of uncertainty to break for the door, shoving 2 guards aside with inhuman strength. As he disappeared down the corridor, the remaining security personnel helped Jax to his feet and escorted us out of the restricted area. Within hours, the base was in chaos. Captain Hale had vanished, presumably hiding somewhere in the vast network of tunnels and chambers that made up Fort Varian. Dr. Rhodes was placed under observation in the medical bay, though she insisted she was fine and demanded to be returned to her research. General Wallace finally made an appearance, addressing the senior personnel in a tense briefing. He acknowledged the existence of the objects, but downplayed their significance, describing them as advanced technology from an unknown source being studied for defensive purposes. He made no mention of Hale's bizarre behavior or the effects the objects seemed to be having on personnel. "Security protocols have been temporarily increased," he announced. "All research on the recent acquisition has been suspended pending a full review. Captain Hale is believed to be suffering from exposure to an unknown compound and should be considered unstable but not dangerous. If located, he is to be escorted to medical for evaluation." It was all damage control, designed to contain the situation rather than address the real threat. As the briefing ended, General Wallace approached me directly. "Sergeant Carter, a word in private," he said, gesturing to a side office. Once inside, his professional demeanor dropped slightly. He looked tired, the weight of command evident in the lines of his face. "You've caused quite a disruption," he said, his tone more resigned than angry. "Accessing classified files, breaking into restricted areas. These are serious violations." "With respect, sir, what's happening here goes beyond security protocols," I replied. "These objects are affecting people's minds. Captain Hale isn't the only one. There are others showing similar symptoms, just not as advanced." Wallace sighed heavily. "I'm aware of the effects. We've been studying them for years, learning to contain and control them. What you don't understand is the potential these artifacts represent. The technological advances they could provide would put us decades ahead of any potential adversary." "At what cost, sir?" Captain Hale was talking about these objects as markers for something coming to wipe out humanity. "Hale is delusional from prolonged exposure," Wallace said dismissively. "We've seen similar psychotic breaks in previous research subjects. The objects do emit a type of radiation that affects neural pathways. That's why exposure is strictly limited for most personnel." "Most personnel." "Dr. Rhodes has unique resistance to the effects. She's been able to work with the artifacts longer than anyone else without significant psychological impact." I thought of Rhodes in the vault, convulsing as energy flowed into her body, speaking in that inhuman language. That didn't look like resistance to me. Sir, I believe we're in danger, not just the personnel here, but potentially much more. These objects are active, communicating with each other. They need to be contained more securely or destroyed. Wallace's expression hardened. Destroying them is not an option. And as for containment, we have the situation well in hand. He straightened up. You and Corporal Anderson are being transferred. A transport will arrive tomorrow to take you to a debriefing facility where you'll receive appropriate medical screening and sign additional non-disclosure agreements. You're removing us because we know too much, I said, anger rising in my voice. I'm removing you because you've demonstrated an inability to follow orders and respect security protocols, he replied coldly. Be ready at 8 a.m. tomorrow. You're confined to quarters until then. That night, as I packed my few belongings, there was a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Private Emily Grant, looking even more exhausted than before. I heard you're being transferred, she said quietly. I need to tell you something before you go. I let her in, checking the corridor to ensure no one had seen her. My grandfather worked here, she said once the door was closed. Back in the 70s, he wasn't supposed to talk about it, but when he was dying, he told my mother and she told me after I got assigned here. He said the mountain wasn't just a base, it was a prison. A prison for what? Not what, who. The original object that fell in 1962 wasn't empty like the recent ones. Something came out of it, something that looked human but wasn't. They contained it somewhere deep in the mountain, in a special chamber they built just for it. Is it still here? I asked, feeling a chill despite the room's regulated temperature. Emily nodded. My grandfather said it never aged, never needed food or water. It just sat in its chamber, sometimes speaking in languages no one could understand. He called it the guest. Did it ever affect people like what's happening now? According to my grandfather, anyone who spent too long with it started to change. They'd hear voices, see things that weren't there. Some became obsessed with building devices to amplify the signal, whatever that meant. Others just stopped being themselves. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket. After you triggered the alarm in level F, I accessed some old emergency protocols. There's a failsafe built into this mountain, a self-destruct system designed to collapse the entire facility if something goes catastrophically wrong. I think that's why they built it here, so they could bury everything if necessary. The paper contained access codes and a map showing the location of the failsafe system. Why are you giving me this? Emily's eyes filled with tears. Because I don't think I'm myself anymore. I'm losing more time, finding notes I don't remember writing. Yesterday I woke up in level E with no memory of how I got there. I think it's spreading, whatever this is, and faster than before. Before I could respond, the base alarm system activated. Not the security breach alarm from earlier, but a different tone, more urgent and insistent. Warning, containment breach in Sector 7B. All personnel implement lockdown protocol immediately. This is not a drill. Emily's face went pale. Sector 7B, that's where they keep the original guest. The lights flickered, then dimmed as the base switched to emergency power. In the red glow of the emergency lights, Emily's face looked gaunt and alien. It's starting, she whispered. My grandfather said if the guest ever got free, it would call the others home. That's what all these falling objects have been building toward, a beacon strong enough to reach across space. I grabbed my backpack, shoving in essentials and the paper Emily had given me. We need to find Jax, I said, then get to the failsafe controls. The corridors were chaos personnel rushing to security stations or barricading themselves in secure rooms. The alarm continued to blare, punctuated by occasional static-filled announcements that cut off mid-sentence. We found Jax in the communications center, frantically working at his station. Something's happening to all the objects, he said without looking up. They're all activating simultaneously, putting out some kind of signal that's disrupting our systems. He finally noticed Emily. Who's she? Private Grant. She knows things about this place we don't. I explained quickly. The original object had something inside it, something that's been contained here since the 60s. It's loose now. Jax's eyes widened. That explains the energy readings I'm getting. Look at this. He pointed to a screen showing power fluctuations throughout the base. Something's drawing massive amounts of energy from our systems, directing it toward. He typed rapidly, bringing up a schematic of the facility. Level H. I didn't even know there was a level H. It's below the vault level, Emily said quietly. Reserved for the most dangerous containment. The facility shook suddenly, dust falling from the ceiling as a deep rumble passed through the mountain. The screens flickered, some going dark entirely. We need to activate the failsafe, I said, showing Jax the paper Emily had provided. This mountain was designed to be collapsed if necessary, to bury everything inside it. Including us, Jax noted grimly. There are emergency evacuation tunnels, Emily said. Not many people know about them. They lead to a bunker about a mile from the base. If we can reach them after activating the failsafe, we might have a chance. Another tremor shook the base, stronger this time. The lights went out completely for several seconds before the emergency systems kicked in. Okay, Jax said, gathering equipment. The failsafe controls are on level A. We'll need to bypass multiple security checkpoints to reach them. I can help with that, came a voice from the doorway. We spun around to see Dr. Rhodes, her lab coat torn and stained, a security badge clutched in her trembling hand. I have access. You're part of this, I accused. I saw you in the vault, communing with those things. Dr. Rhodes laughed bitterly. Is that what you think? I've been fighting this for decades, Sergeant. Trying to understand these objects, yes, but to find a way to neutralize them, not use them. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. I was contaminated years ago, during my first exposure. I've been fighting its influence ever since, using its own connection against it to learn its weaknesses. Why should we trust you? Jax demanded. Because I'm the one who built the failsafe in the first place, she replied. Against Wallace's orders. He thinks these objects can be controlled, weaponized. He's wrong. They have only one purpose, to call their makers back to this world. Another violent tremor shook the room, knocking equipment from shelves. An announcement crackled over the speakers. All personnel evacuate immediately. Repeat, all personnel evacuate immediately. Wallace has lost control, Dr. Rhodes said. He thought he could manage the guest, communicate with it. Instead it was using him, waiting for this moment. She held up her security badge. This will get us to level A. We need to move now. Desperate times called for desperate allies. We followed Dr. Rhodes through the increasingly unstable facility, navigating corridors filled with smoke and panicked personnel. Security was in disarray, most checkpoints abandoned as guards fled the collapsing base. As we approached level A, we encountered a barricade manned by a handful of soldiers. Their commanding officer, a lieutenant I didn't recognize, raised his weapon as we approached. Hold it right there, he ordered. No one passes by order of General Wallace. Lieutenant, the base is coming apart, I said. We need to reach the evacuation tunnels. No one evacuates until the general gives the order, he insisted, though I could see fear in his eyes. He's implementing containment protocols. Dr. Rhodes stepped forward. Wallace is compromised, Lieutenant. The containment breach has affected his judgment. Look around you. The facility is collapsing. Those tremors aren't natural. As if on cue, another violent shake sent cracks spreading through the concrete walls. One of the soldiers at the barricade looked up in alarm. Sir, we should fall back to the evac point. The lieutenant hesitated, his resolve visibly weakening. Before he could decide, the lights flickered again, and in that brief darkness, I heard a sound that froze my blood, a rhythmic clicking punctuated by low humming tones, the same inhuman language I'd heard Dr. Rhodes speaking in the vault. When the lights returned, Captain Hale stood at the far end of the corridor, but it wasn't the Hale I knew. His uniform was torn and dirty, his skin pale with a faint blue luminescence. His eyes glowed with the same unearthly light as the objects in the vault. There is no evacuation, he said, his voice overlaid with that strange clicking. The signal is complete. They are coming. The soldiers turned, weapons raised. Captain Hale, sir, you need to stand down, the lieutenant ordered, his voice shaking. Hale tilted his head at an impossible angle, regarding them with those glowing eyes. Captain Hale is gone. This body serves a greater purpose now. He raised his hand, and a pulse of blue energy erupted from his palm, striking the lieutenant and sending him flying backward. The other soldiers opened fire, but the bullets seemed to slow as they approached Hale, dropping harmlessly to the floor. "Run," Dr. Rhodes shouted, pulling me toward a side passage. "The failsafe controls are this way." We fled as the sounds of screams and that terrible clicking language echoed behind us. Jax and Emily followed close behind, the four of us racing through increasingly damaged sections of the facility. The tremors were almost constant now, the mountain itself seeming to rebel against what was happening within it. There, Dr. Rhodes pointed to a heavy blast door at the end of a corridor, the failsafe chamber. She pressed her badge against the scanner, and the door slid open with agonizing slowness. Inside was a small room containing a single console with a prominent red button, protected by a key-locked cover. The failsafe will trigger a series of controlled explosions throughout the mountain's support structure, Dr. Rhodes explained, inserting a key from around her neck into the console. It will collapse the entire facility inward, burying everything under millions of tons of rock. "Including the objects?" I asked. "It won't destroy them," she replied grimly, "but it will contain them. Interrupt the signal they're generating and buy humanity time." Time for what? To prepare, to find a more permanent solution. She turned the key and the cover over the button slid back. "The evacuation tunnel entrance is 2 levels up, section C7. Once I activate this, we'll have 20 minutes to reach it before the charges detonate." Emily suddenly grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here," she whispered. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, our breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. The door we had entered through remained open, but beyond it, the corridor was now filled with a swirling blue mist. Within that mist, a figure took shape. Humanoid but wrong somehow, its proportions subtly off, its movements too fluid to be natural. "The guest," Dr. Rhodes breathed, her finger hovering over the fail-safe button. The figure stepped into the room, the mist following it like a living cloak. It had the appearance of a tall, thin man in an outdated military uniform, but its skin was translucent, veins glowing with the same blue light as the objects. Its face was almost human, but the eyes were solid orbs of light, and where a mouth should be was only a series of vertical slits that opened and closed as it breathed. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "You have served your purpose well," it said, its mental voice carrying emotions of satisfaction and anticipation. "The signal is complete. The Watchers have heard and are coming to reclaim this world." "Who are the Watchers?" Jax demanded, his voice barely a whisper. The creature's head turned toward him with unnatural smoothness. "Those who seeded this world long before your kind crawled from the oceans. Those who watched your evolution as an experiment, never expecting you to spread so far or develop such destructive tendencies." Its mental voice carried a wave of disdain. "The experiment has yielded interesting data, but it has run its course." "You're talking about the extinction of humanity," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "A correction," it replied indifferently, "a reset to allow for a new direction." Its attention shifted to Dr. Rhodes, who still stood poised over the fail-safe button. "That will not stop what is coming. The signal has already been sent." "Maybe not," Dr. Rhodes said, her voice surprisingly calm. "But it will bury you in your markers deep enough that they'll have to dig to find you. And humans are very good at noticing when something digs into our planet." The creature made a sound like breaking glass, a laugh I realized with horror. "Your species has such a limited understanding of time. The Watchers have waited millions of years for this moment. They can wait a few more to excavate this site if necessary." As it spoke, the blue mist began to fill the room, tendrils of it reaching toward us like searching fingers. Where it touched bare skin, it left a burning sensation and a lingering glow. Emily screamed as one tendril wrapped around her wrist, her skin immediately taking on that same blue luminescence. In that moment of distraction, Dr. Rhodes slammed her hand down on the fail-safe button. Immediately, klaxons began to blare throughout the facility, and a mechanical voice announced, Failsafe activated. Complete evacuation immediately. Detonation in T-minus 20 minutes. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. It surged forward, the blue mist condensing into a solid form that slammed Dr. Rhodes against the wall. She gasped in pain but managed a defiant smile. "Too late," she wheezed. "You're going back into your prison, deeper this time." The creature's mental voice flooded our minds with rage. "You will not leave this place alive." It turned toward us, those glowing eyes fixing on mine, starting with the one who first saw the marker fall. I backed away, pulling Emily with me. The glow on her wrist was spreading up her arm, her eyes beginning to take on the same unearthly light. Jax moved between us and the creature, a makeshift weapon fashioned from a broken pipe in his hands. "Get to the evacuation tunnel," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "I'll hold it off." "You can't fight that thing," I protested. "I don't need to beat it, I just need to slow it down." He glanced back at me, a sad smile on his face. 20 minutes, remember? We only need to stay ahead of it until then." Before I could argue further, he lunged at the creature, swinging the pipe with all his strength. Incredibly, it connected, the creature recoiling as if the simple metal had actually hurt it. Dr. Rhodes, still pinned against the wall, shouted, "Iron, it's vulnerable to cold iron." That moment of distraction was all we needed. I grabbed Emily, who was now trembling violently as the blue glow continued to spread through her body, and dragged her toward the exit while Jax continued to fend off the creature. "I'll get her to the evacuation point," I told Jax. "Follow as soon as you can." The last I saw as we fled the chamber was Jax swinging desperately at the advancing creature. Dr. Rhodes slumped against the wall, her eyes locked with mine in a silent message, "Run." The facility was in full evacuation mode, personnel streaming toward emergency exits. The tremors had increased in intensity and frequency, chunks of concrete falling from the ceiling as the mountain's structural integrity began to fail. The mechanical voice continued its countdown. Detonation in T-minus 17 minutes. Emily was deteriorating rapidly, the blue glow now covering most of her upper body. Her movements became increasingly erratic, sometimes fighting against me, other times going completely limp. "I can hear them," she whispered during a moment of lucidity. "The Watchers, they're so close now." I half carried, half dragged her through the collapsing corridors, following the evacuation signs toward Section C7. Around us, the base was coming apart. Equipment exploding in showers of sparks, support beams cracking under the strain, the air filling with dust and smoke. We reached C7 to find a bottleneck of personnel trying to enter the evacuation tunnel, a narrow passage that led upward through the mountain. Security officers were trying to maintain order, but panic was setting in as the countdown continued. Detonation in T-minus 12 minutes. Emily suddenly went rigid in my arms, her back arching unnaturally. When she spoke, her voice had the same overlay of clicks and hums I'd heard from Hale. "They come for this world. All who hear the call will serve as vessels." I looked into her eyes and saw nothing of the young private remained, only that eerie blue glow. With a strength that couldn't be her own, she grabbed my throat, her fingers burning into my skin where they touched. "Let her go," a familiar voice called out, and suddenly Jax was there, striking Emily's arm with his pipe. She released me, hissing in pain as the iron connected with her glowing skin. "Dr. Rhodes," I gasped, rubbing my throat. Jax shook his head grimly. "She didn't make it. The creature, it did something to her. She's gone." Emily was recovering from the blow, her movements becoming more fluid and inhuman with each passing second. Around us, other personnel were beginning to exhibit similar symptoms. Blue glows emerging from their eyes, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. "The influence is spreading," Jax said, keeping the pipe between us and Emily. "Whatever that guest thing is, it's taking control of more people." "We need to get into that tunnel," I said, eyeing the narrowing path to evacuation. The security officers at the entrance were becoming more aggressive, physically pushing back people they deemed too panicked or disorderly. Detonation in T-minus 9 minutes. "We won't make it that way," Jax said, nodding toward a maintenance access panel nearby. "But I know another route. The ventilation system runs parallel to the evacuation tunnel. It'll be tight, but we should fit." With Emily and other affected personnel closing in on us, we pried open the access panel and squeezed into the narrow shaft beyond. The metal walls were hot to the touch, the air thick with dust and the smell of electrical fires. We crawled as quickly as we could, the sounds of the base's destruction growing louder around us. Detonation in T-6 minutes. The shaft inclined sharply upward, making progress slower and more difficult. My arms and legs burned with the effort, but the thought of what awaited behind us pushed me forward. Jax led the way, occasionally stopping to check a schematic he'd downloaded to his phone before the systems went down. Almost there, he called back. The shaft should open into a maintenance room near the surface. A violent tremor shook the mountain, the metal shaft buckling around us. For a terrifying moment, I thought we would be crushed, but the old construction held. Barely. As we continued upward, I began to hear something in the shaft behind us, the scrape of movement, punctuated by that now familiar clicking language. "They're in the vents," I warned Jax. "Move faster." Detonation in T-3 minutes. Finally, Jax reached a grate above us. With desperate strength, he pushed it open and pulled himself out, then reached back to help me. We emerged into a small concrete room filled with electrical equipment, a heavy door on the far side marked "Emergency Exit." The door was locked with a keypad. Jax immediately began trying various codes, his fingers flying over the numbers as precious seconds ticked away. Detonation in T-2 minutes. "Any of those codes working?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the vent we had emerged from, waiting for the inevitable appearance of our pursuers. "Almost got it," Jax muttered. "The emergency overrides should." The door clicked and swung open slightly. "Got it." Beyond the door was a narrow tunnel sloping upward, rough-hewn from the mountain stone with minimal reinforcement. We raced up the incline, the countdown continuing to echo through the facility below us. Detonation in T-1 minute. The tunnel seemed endless, our lungs burning as we pushed ourselves to the limit. Finally, I saw light ahead, natural light, not the artificial fluorescence of the base. One final bend in the tunnel, and we emerged into the open air, stumbling out onto the mountainside several hundred yards from the main entrance to Fort Varian. In the valley below, we could see military vehicles evacuating personnel, racing away from the doomed facility. Without a word, we began running downhill, putting as much distance between ourselves and the mountain as possible. 30 seconds to detonation. We didn't make it far enough. The first explosions began deep within the mountain, a series of sequential detonations designed to collapse the facility inward. The ground bucked beneath our feet, throwing us forward. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from my lungs as the world around us descended into chaos. The mountain itself seemed to shrink, the peak slumping inward as the internal structure collapsed. A cloud of dust rose into the sky, blocking out the sun and enveloping everything in a choking haze. The roar was deafening, like the mountain itself was screaming in pain. I lost consciousness briefly, the concussive force of the collapse too much for my battered body to withstand. When I came to, the world was eerily silent, my ears ringing from the explosion. Through the settling dust, I could make out Jax's form nearby, stirring weakly. "We made it," he coughed, his face covered in dirt and blood from a cut on his forehead. "Holy shit, we actually made it." I sat up slowly, my body protesting with every movement. Where Fort Varian had been was now a massive depression in the mountainside, as if some giant had taken a bite out of the peak. Of the facility itself, nothing was visible. Millions of tons of rock now covered its remains. In the valley below, I could see the evacuation convoy stopped, personnel staring back at the destroyed mountain in shock and awe. Military helicopters circled overhead, presumably assessing the damage and looking for survivors. "Think it worked?" Jax asked quietly. "Is it contained?" I looked at the collapsed mountain, thinking of the guest and the objects now buried deep beneath tons of rock. "For now," I said, "but Dr. Rhodes was right. It won't destroy them, just buy us time." Time for what? I didn't have an answer for that. In the silence that followed, I noticed something odd, a faint blue glow emanating from beneath the dirt on my hand where Emily had grabbed me. As I watched, it faded slowly, leaving only a slight discoloration like a fading bruise. "We need to warn people," I said finally. "There might be other facilities, other objects that have fallen." Jax nodded grimly. Who's going to believe us? They'll classify everything that happened here, swear the survivors to secrecy. We'll probably spend the next year in debriefings and psych evaluations. He was right, of course. Even as we spoke, I could see military security forces beginning to move up the valley toward us, no doubt to secure any witnesses to what had happened. Then we'll find another way, I said, struggling to my feet. Because if what that thing said is true, the Watchers are coming. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they're coming. As the security forces approached, I looked up at the sky, clear blue and innocent, revealing nothing of what might be approaching from the depths of space. Somewhere out there, something ancient had received a signal from Earth, a beacon calling it home to a world it considered its property. And when it arrived, humanity would face its greatest test. The containment of Fort Varian had bought us time, but how much, no one could say. Late that night, he found her alone in the monitoring room, staring at screens displaying news broadcasts from around the world. To the casual observer, the reports showed normal events, weather, politics, entertainment. But Carter had trained herself to see the patterns hidden within the images and sound, subliminal signals embedding themselves in the viewer's subconscious. Can't sleep? Green asked, setting a cup of coffee beside her. She accepted it gratefully. Every time I close my eyes, I see their world, their dimension. It's beautiful in a terrible way. Geometries that can't exist in our reality, colors we don't have names for. Green sat beside her. You're fighting it better than anyone. Tommy Hayes succumbed within weeks. You've held out 6 months. I'm not fighting it well enough, she admitted. Each time I connect, it becomes harder to disconnect completely. Parts of me stay there, in their consciousness, and parts of them stay in mine. She turned to him, eyes haunted. I'm afraid, Samuel. Afraid that by the time we reach Denver, there won't be enough of Evelyn Carter left to help you. Green took her hand, noting how cold her skin felt. Then we go tomorrow, before the alignment. Hit them while they're still preparing. She nodded slowly. There's something else you should know. When I connect, I can sense Tommy Hayes. He's still in there, still conscious in some way, but he's not the only one. There are thousands now, maybe millions, their individual minds networked into a collective consciousness, and at the center of it all, Faulkner. Green finished for her. What's left of her, Carter confirmed. She's become something else, a conduit. An interface between the entity and humanity. She guides the transformation, directs the network. If we can reach her, disrupt her connection to the central node, we might be able to destabilize the entire system, Green realized. Their plan crystallized around this new information. A small strike team would infiltrate the Denver facility, targeting the central node and Faulkner herself. The resistance would coordinate diversionary actions at the secondary nodes, spreading the entity's attention and resources thin. By dawn, they were ready. Their team consisted of Green, Carter, Cooper, and 3 former Special Forces operators who had witnessed the entity's influence firsthand during classified operations. They carried equipment designed to disrupt the entity's electromagnetic signatures and weapons that, in theory, could affect both physical and non-physical manifestations. Remember, Green told the team during their final briefing, what we're facing doesn't fully exist in our reality. Conventional weapons may be useless against certain aspects of it. That's why each of you has been equipped with the disruptor devices Dr. Carter designed. The devices, compact units generating specific frequency patterns, were the result of Carter's unique understanding of the entity's nature. They created a localized field that temporarily severed the connection between the entity and human consciousness, providing a window of clarity for those partially under its influence. Their journey to Denver was tense, avoiding main routes and checkpoints where the entity's influence might be strongest. They observed the subtle signs of transformation spreading across the country, people moving with uncanny coordination, construction projects advancing with impossible speed, communication systems being modified in ways that made no logical sense unless viewed as components of a larger, hidden network. They reached Denver as sunset painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The airport stood on the eastern plains, its distinctive white tensile roof structures resembling mountain peaks, or, as some had noted years before its true purpose was understood, ceremonial tents from some ancient ritual. Using credentials provided by their inside contact, they gained access to a maintenance area beneath the main terminal. The facility below was far more extensive than the public imagined, level after level descending into the earth, each more secure than the last. The central node is at the lowest level, Carter whispered as they navigated through service corridors, avoiding security personnel whose synchronized movements betrayed their connection to the entity. I can feel it pulling at me, trying to establish connection. Green noticed her speech patterns changing subtly, becoming more formal, precise. The entity's influence was growing stronger as they descended. "Stay with me, Evelyn," he said, using her first name deliberately to reinforce her human identity. "Focus on why we're here." They encountered their first real resistance at a security checkpoint 3 levels down. The guards moved with inhuman coordination, anticipating their approach before they came into view. The disruptor devices proved effective but had limited range. They needed to get close to use them, exposing themselves to danger. During the brief but intense confrontation, one of their team members was lost, touched by a guard whose fingers elongated upon contact, merging with the operative's flesh. The transformation was horrifyingly swift, their allies' features melting and reforming into something no longer recognizable as human before Green could put him down with a shot to the head. "They're adapting to our disruptors," Carter observed, her scientific mind still analyzing despite the horror of their situation. "Each exposure teaches them how to counter the frequencies." They pressed on, descending further. The architecture changed gradually, sterile government facility giving way to the organic, flowing designs they had seen at Blackwood. The walls pulsed with bioluminescence, responding to their presence with patterns that hurt the eyes and induced vertigo in those who looked too long. Cooper, monitoring communications through a specialized headset, suddenly tensed. Something's happening on the surface. News feeds are going haywire, some kind of announcement being broadcast globally. Green checked his watch. The alignment's not for another 12 hours. They're moving early. "Or this is preparation," Carter suggested, softening the collective consciousness, making it receptive. At the 5th level down, they encountered something unexpected, a massive chamber filled with rows of clear cylindrical tanks, each containing a human form suspended in fluid. Some were recognizably human, others partially transformed with elongated limbs, altered facial features, translucent skin revealing modified internal structures. "Incubation chambers," Carter explained, her voice hollow. "They're accelerating the physical transformation in selected subjects, creating interfaces, bodies capable of channeling greater portions of the entity's consciousness into our reality." Cooper moved closer to one of the tanks, examining the occupant. "My God, this one's just a child." "Younger minds are more adaptable," Carter said mechanically, then shook her head violently as if trying to dislodge the thought. "No, that's not me, that's it, thinking through me." Green took her arm. "We need to keep moving. The central node is what matters." As they continued their descent, the final level opened before them. A vast cathedral-like space carved from the living rock. Unlike Blackwood's chamber, this one showed evidence of deliberate design. Ancient symbols covering every surface, arrangements of crystals and metals forming patterns that corresponded to astronomical alignments. And at the center, a pit similar to what they'd seen before, but immeasurably larger. The entity within it had grown, its constantly shifting form now filling the massive depression and extending tendrils up the sides like a living tree seeking light. Standing on a platform extending over the pit was Faulkner, or what remained of her. Her transformation was complete. Her body no longer remotely human. She had become a living conduit. Her form elongated and fluid, skin translucent and glowing with internal light, limbs numbering more than 4 and moving with impossible grace. Surrounding her were dozens of partially transformed humans, their movements synchronized with hers, forming a living computer processing the entity's will and translating it into actions across the global network. Carter gasped, doubling over as if struck. The connection, it's so strong here. I can feel it pulling at my mind. Green activated his disruptor to maximum power, creating a protective field around them. Cooper set the charges, focus on the support structures and the equipment surrounding the pit. Their plan was simple but desperate. Plant explosive devices at critical points, disrupting the physical infrastructure supporting the entity's manifestation, then escape before detonation. With the primary node destabilized, the secondary nodes might fail to activate properly during the alignment. But Faulkner had sensed their presence. She turned toward them, her movements liquid and graceful, eyes that were now just pools of luminescent fluid fixing on them with terrible recognition. "Agent Green," she said, her voice a harmonic chorus rather than a single sound. "Dr. Carter, we've been expecting you." Green raised his weapon, knowing it was likely useless but unwilling to surrender without a fight. "This ends now, Faulkner. Whatever you think you're creating, it's not evolution, it's extinction." "Extinction is a limited concept," Faulkner replied, echoing her words from Blackwood. "What dies is the isolation of individual consciousness. What emerges is unity, connection, the true potential of mind unbound by physical limitations." As she spoke, the entity in the pit surged upward, tendrils extending further outward. The transformed humans around her moved in perfect unison, forming a defensive perimeter. Cooper had managed to place several charges undetected and rejoined them, detonator in hand. "Ready on your mark," he whispered to Green. Carter suddenly straightened, her eyes clearing. "It's happening," she said urgently. "The alignment. It's not in 12 hours. It's now. They've been feeding us false information." As if confirming her words, the entity surged upward with renewed vigor. The bioluminescence throughout the chamber intensified, pulsing in complex patterns. Above, they could feel rather than hear a change. Energy building, reality itself growing thin as barriers between dimensions weakened. "Faulkner," Green called out, making one final attempt to reach whatever humanity might remain in her. "You are an agent, sworn to protect people. This isn't protection, it's annihilation." Faulkner tilted her transformed head, an almost curious gesture. "You still don't understand. This was always the plan, from the first moments humanity gained self-awareness. We were designed to be vessels, created to house their consciousness when they returned." "Created by whom?" Cooper demanded. "By them," Faulkner replied simply. "The cycle has repeated countless times. They seed a world, guide evolution toward intelligence, then return to inhabit the forms that develop. Earth is just one of many gardens they've cultivated." As she spoke, Carter began to change, her back arched, eyes rolling back as the entity's influence overwhelmed Green's disruptor field. Her voice, when it emerged, was not her own. "The alignment completes," she said, the words flowing with unnatural precision. "The gateway opens, the transformation begins." Green grabbed her shoulders. "Evelyn, fight it. Stay with me." For a moment her eyes cleared, recognition and fear flooding back. "Samuel," she gasped. "Do it now. Trigger the charges. It's our only chance." Cooper raised the detonator, finger poised over the trigger, when a tendril of the entity's substance lashed out with impossible speed, wrapping around his arm. Where it touched, his flesh began to transform, merging with the substance. He screamed, dropping the detonator which Green managed to catch before it hit the ground. "Now," Carter urged, fighting visibly against the influence trying to claim her. "While I can still hold it back." Green hesitated, looking at Cooper who was rapidly transforming, at Carter whose resistance was weakening by the second, at the impossible entity rising from the pit with increasing power as the alignment progressed. "The world needs to know," he said, pressing the detonator into Carter's hand. "Someone has to tell the truth." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Samuel, no." "Tell them everything," he continued, backing away toward Faulkner and the pit. "Find a way to fight it. There's always hope." Before she could stop him, Green charged toward Faulkner, tackling her transformed body and sending them both tumbling toward the edge of the pit. Carter screamed his name as he and Faulkner fell into the writhing mass of the entity below. The moment of contact was beyond description. Green's consciousness simultaneously expanded and shattered, his sense of self dissolving into a vast ocean of mind spanning millennia and dimensions. He saw the truth then, the entity's origins in the earliest days of Earth, its patient existence alongside evolving life, its careful guidance of human development through subtle influence and direct intervention. And he saw its purpose, not destruction, but transformation, the absorption of human consciousness into a collective that transcended physical limitations and individual death. In that brief, eternal moment, he understood the entity's perspective, the loneliness of its ancient existence, the desire to share rather than simply dominate. But he also held firm to his humanity, to the value of individual choice and free will. As his physical form merged with the entity, his consciousness fought to maintain integrity, to remain Samuel Green amidst the vast collective attempting to absorb him. Above, Carter watched in horror as Green disappeared into the pit. With the last of her resistance, she activated the detonator. Explosions rocked the chamber, support structures collapsing, equipment destroyed in cascading failures. The remaining Special Forces operative grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the exit as the chamber began to collapse around them. The last thing she saw before they escaped was the pit, the entity within it surging upward one final time, and within its shifting mass, for the briefest moment, a human form that might have been Green, arm outstretched as if reaching for her before being reabsorbed into the whole. 3 days later, in a safe house hundreds of miles from Denver, Carter watched news reports of the terrorist attack on Denver International Airport. The official story described a structural failure caused by extremists, resulting in limited casualties and airport closure. Nothing was mentioned of the levels beneath the entity or the narrowly averted transformation of humanity. But Carter knew the truth. The disruption had worked, temporarily. The alignment had passed without full manifestation. The entity's network had been destabilized, its influence weakened but not destroyed. It remained, patient as always, adapting to this setback as it had to others throughout its ancient existence. She touched the small device at her temple, a modified version of Green's disruptor now surgically implanted to maintain a constant field protecting her consciousness from the entity's influence. It wouldn't last forever, nothing would. The entity had time on its side, and humanity remained largely unaware of the threat. Cooper had survived his partial transformation, though his arm remained changed, the flesh pearlescent and slightly fluid, occasionally moving of its own accord. They kept him sedated most of the time, studying the transformation process, looking for weaknesses they could exploit in the future. Their resistance network had grown in the aftermath of Denver, more people recognizing the subtle signs of the entity's influence and seeking ways to combat it. Carter led them now, her unique sensitivity providing early warnings of the entity's activities while her scientific mind developed better protections. On her desk lay Tommy Hayes' journal, recovered from the wreckage of Blackwood, alongside notes from their investigation and the evidence they'd gathered. Beside them was a new journal, her own, documenting everything she'd learned about the entity, its methods, and potential vulnerabilities. When the time came, when the entity tried again, humanity would need this knowledge. And somewhere in a dimension adjacent to their own, within the vast collective consciousness of the entity, a fragment of Samuel Green remained. Not fully absorbed, not entirely transformed, but watching, learning, and perhaps, though Carter dared not hope too strongly, finding a way to fight from within. The Roswell incident had not been what the public believed. Not an alien visitation, but the first visible sign of an awakening that had been millennia in the making. The crash in 1947 was merely the beginning of a larger story that continued to unfold, hidden beneath the surface of everyday reality. As Carter looked out the window at the setting sun, she knew with terrible certainty that this wasn't the end. The entity would return, would find new ways to manifest, new minds to influence. The transformation it sought had been delayed, not prevented. The war for humanity's future had only just begun, and the truth about Roswell, the dark, ancient truth, would eventually be revealed to all. The only question was whether that revelation would come as warning or epitaph for the human race. In the growing darkness, Carter returned to her work, preparing for a future where the barriers between worlds would thin once more and the entity would reach again for the consciousness it had cultivated so patiently for so long. The choice that faced humanity was not whether to face this ancient force, but how, as willing participants in a transformation beyond understanding, or as defenders of individuality and free will, fighting to preserve what made them human in the face of something older, vaster, and utterly alien to everything they valued. The true horror of Roswell wasn't what had fallen from the sky, but what had always been beneath the ground, waiting to rise.